Well, welcome back once again to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and I'm glad that you're here today. Well, here's our rhythm again. 10 minutes unhurried with Jesus, not to prove anything, but to be changed from the inside out. Today, we're in Luke chapter 5 and 6, and these chapters show what happens when Jesus steps into everyday life, work, sickness, religion, relationships, and his grace starts interrupting what's normal. But notice this. Jesus doesn't disrupt to shame us. He disrupts to restore. He calls, heals, forgives, recenters, and teaches us what mercy really looks like. So if you feel interrupted or exposed or in need of a fresh start, today is for you. So let's settle in and get started. Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, it's from empty nets to abundant grace. Jesus is teaching by the lake. Fishermen are washing empty nets. And in verse 4, Jesus says to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a drought." Simon answers honestly in verse 5, "We have toiled all night and have taken nothing." And then they catch a great multitude of fish in verse 6. Then Simon falls at Jesus' knees. And he says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." That's in verse 8. Jesus responds with grace in verse 10. "Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men." Jesus meets honesty with calling, not rejection. So what's the principle? Jesus calls people not after perfection, but after humility. Next in chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, "I will, be thou clean." A man full of leprosy kneels before Jesus. In verse 12, "Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." Jesus answered simply, "I will, be thou clean." In verse 13. And Luke tells us in verse 13, immediately the leprosy departed from him. Now Jesus touches what others avoid. Compassion always moves him closer. Something to think about? Where do I wonder if Jesus is willing to heal me? And do I believe his answer can still be, "I will"? Next in Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26, forgiveness before healing. Friends lower a paralyzed man through the roof, and Jesus sees their faith and says, "Man, thy sins are forgiven thee." That's in verse 20. Some are offended, but Jesus heals the man anyway. In verse 24, he says, "Arise and take up thy couch." Forgiveness and healing walk together. God's deepest work often begins inside. So what's the principle? Jesus heals the whole person, heart and body. Next in Luke chapter 5, verses 27-32, it's about eating with the unlikely. Jesus calls Levi a tax collector in verse 27 and says, "Follow me." Soon Jesus is eating with the sinners, and religious leaders start to complain. In verse 32, Jesus answers, "I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Grace goes where religion often refuses to sit. So here's something to think about. Who might Jesus be inviting me to see differently? And do I believe grace is for people like me? Next in verse 33 to 39, there's new wine, new life. People question Jesus' practices. In verse 38, he responds, "New wine must be put into new bottles." Now, Jesus is not patching old systems. He is offering new life. Transformation requires openness. Next, in Luke chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, the Lord of the Sabbath. Here we see the disciples pick grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus says in verses 5, "The Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." The Sabbath was meant to restore life, not restrict compassion. So what's the principle? God's laws are meant to give life, not burden it. Next in chapter 6, verses 6 to 11, mercy overrules. Now Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. And he asks in verse 9, is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do evil? He heals the man. In verse 11, others grow angry. Now, doing good may disturb those who prefer control. Next, in chapter 6 of Luke, verses 12 to 16, chosen to be with him. Now, Jesus, we see here that he prays all night, and then he chooses 12 apostles in verses 12 to 13. Notice here that before his mission starts, there is prayer. And then there's calling that flows from the communion of prayer. Next, in Luke chapter 6, verses 20 to 26, blessings that redefine life. Verse 20, Jesus teaches, blessed be ye poor. And then in verse 21, blessed are ye that hunger now. Jesus blesses those who feel empty and unseen. God's kingdom flips expectations upside down here. So what's the principle? God's blessings resets where the world least expects it. Next, in Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 36, it's about love that looks like God. Jesus says in verse 27, love your enemies. Be ye there merciful, as your Father also is merciful, in verse 36. Now this love is not weakness. It reflects God's own heart. Next, in verses 46 to 49, it's about the foundations that last. Jesus ends with an image. He is like a man which built an house and dig deep, in verse 48. Then storms come. The house stands because it was built on a rock. So in closing, I want you to think about this. Luke chapter 5 and 6 reminds us Jesus steps into ordinary life and changes it. Grace calls the humble. Mercy matters more than appearances. Love looks different in God's kingdom. So if today you feel interrupted or challenged, or invited to live differently, remember this. Jesus never disrupts without restoring. He never calls without strengthening. And he always builds lives that can stand. Well, that's it for another day. Thank you again for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. Once again, if your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next time as we continue to walk with Luke in Luke chapter 7. Until then, God bless.